I need some traction. You need some traction.
Really, I'm hoping that everyone has kind of heard of value stream mapping so far, because I think it's an extremely valuable practice for people to have in their tool belt. But if not, I'm going to cover from a very introductory level and to bring you up to speed. And even if you've got a lot of experience with it, you're going to get value out of the session. So really, to put this into context, this technique really works for any size organization, like Russ mentioned. I've run sessions with 10-person startups where we had everybody in the company in the room, and we were really starting to figure out how the company was going to work. And at the other end of the spectrum, looking at 80,000 person companies in the Fortune 100, we were trying to figure out, how do we all get on the same page? How do we all figure out what's actually happening? How we deliver value to our customers. So it can be used regardless of your context, regardless of your team, wherever you are in the organization. And I'll cover a little bit more about how I see that fitting into the picture of an organization. But to kind of set the stage and where I see a lot of growth in this area is in the fall, it was at this conference called the DevOps Enterprise Summit. And it's a lot of really big organizations coming together to share war stories and results about how they're transforming, how they're improving, and really what's making a difference for them. And the story of Nationwide really stood out to me. I mean, this is a giant organization. They've been around for a very long time. And this stat of 2018 really just grabbed me. And I think it's more common than not. When we think about software development, we're really hoping that our engineers are as productive as possible, just shipping value continuously, right? In the case of Nationwide, in 2018, they were only spending 2.5% of their time actually writing code that was delivering any value. And that's to say that this activity of writing code, we don't even know if that's valuable code. We don't even know if that code is going to make it into production and not break everything. We don't know that we're not going to go back and have to rewrite it all. So I think that having that number so low is shocking, because we all expect to have this high level of value being generated by our engineering teams. And they contrasted that with 2019, when they dramatically improved their software delivery process. And the way that they did it was by looking at the value stream, looking at their software delivery value stream and analyzing what they were doing and measuring what was going on so that they could figure out where is everyone spending time, where are we wasting time, where are we not generating value, so that they could really target their improvement efforts. And so I think that this model can really be reproduced in any organization, but you really see incredible results in large organizations where there's a lot going on and nobody really knows what's happening. So to give you a little bit of context on myself, I've been in tech for 20 years. I started out in tech support, so I have a lot of empathy for end users and people who are struggling with just using computers and using software. But I progressed through that, always looking at process, always looking at how can we improve, how can we automate things, how can we take a big picture view to really figure out where we're going to get benefit from using technology and targeting our continuous improvement efforts. So thinking about value streams is really aligned with my whole history in tech. So to sort of lay the groundwork for the presentation, just from a high level, I'm going to cover some history and context about value streams if you're not familiar. We're going to talk about what impacts software delivery, what slows us down, what gets in the way, what makes it complicated. We're going to compare pipelines to value streams. A lot of people talk about pipelines, but there's not a lot of people who talk about value streams. So what is the difference? How do they compare? And then dig into some examples of value stream mapping and how we actually define that activity. What do we get out of it? How do we do it? And what does it look like? And then how to sort of ramp up from the basics. So covering from a very low level, getting started, to how do we layer on additional detail and really get specific value out of value stream mapping. So I encountered value stream mapping originally When I was in university for a short amount of time, I went to a program for business. I was actually getting my Bachelor of Commerce. And in that context, in the business context, value stream mapping is very manufacturing focused, very sort of traditional physical goods manufacturing, where you've got suppliers and you've got raw materials, and all very old school, not very applicable to software, but it kind of broadened my mind to thinking beyond software delivery lifecycle like Scrum or Agile or Waterfall. And if you haven't seen a typical value stream, this is what it looks like. It's really hard to understand. There's a lot of moving pieces. You kind of need an education just to read it. You know, there's a lot of symbols and complexity there. And it doesn't really align very well to software delivery. You know, we very seldom have trucks involved in the software delivery process. So there's limited value in sort of using the history of value stream mapping in a modern context. But what I aim to do is basically take the 20% of value stream mapping that's giving us 80% of the value. And really where the value comes in value stream mapping is this idea of figuring out where we are, right? Taking a look at our surroundings from a big picture view. So stepping away, what does the end-to-end process look like of either shipping software or onboarding a new client or onboarding a new staff member? There's really a large number of processes that we can think of in terms of a value stream, and framing it in terms of value is incredibly powerful. But this where are we is kind of based on what is our current state? How do we measure our current surroundings? And then figure out where we want to go from here, which is very difficult if you don't know your baseline, right? It's very difficult to say, I'm going to head in a specific direction if you don't know where you are, if you don't know where you're going, if you don't know what's between where you are and where you're going. And I think that in terms of navigation, when we're talking about making decisions, setting priorities, figuring out how to align as a team towards a common vision, this idea of using maps and compasses together is an incredibly powerful thing. So I see value stream maps as a part of just a generic mapping process. And it's incredibly valuable to have maps compared to what we have when we look at compasses. So I see compasses in organizations as North Star metrics, things like OKRs, where we're setting goals, vision. These are points in the sky that we sort of set our sights on. And by combining where we're setting our sights with our current surroundings and what's ahead of us by way of a map, we really have a powerful combination of saying, okay, we know where we're going, we know what's in between us and where we want to go, and now we can make very high quality decisions about, you know, where do we want to cross the river, how are we going to cross that ridgeway, and in the software world, that could be, you know, where are we tackling our bottlenecks, how are we going to solve deployment or testing. So I see it paralleling very well with the idea of maps and compasses. So we look at starting where we are. This you may recognize as sort of a common practice, especially with teams that have been around for quite some time. Maybe they're project teams, they've just been thrown together to do something. And often what happens is we have a lot of communication challenges, we have a lot of alignment challenges, we have a lot of delays, there's a lot of disruption that can happen. It's hard to get everybody on the same page and pulling in the right direction. And I think, you know, looking at a value stream really helps us kind of pull together that vision and get people focused on delivering value and getting the work done. What happens in software delivery is we don't often measure really important things that impact our ability to get the work done. And if we're looking at some various metrics, this list here is a starting point. There's any number of things that you could be measuring. But what happens is we don't often measure these things, right? We might measure a few, we might be measuring completely different things. But what often affects teams is that it takes a while to be able to measure things. It can take 12 months to set up a system that's just collecting data that someone might analyze someday and then be able to figure out how are we actually doing, right? What's actually slowing us down? Are we being slowed down at any specific point, and where is that point? So if we look at things like lead time, this is the idea of start to finish. How long does it take us to accomplish a task? Usually delivering value to our customers, right? So it can be a feature, it can be a change, it can be a bug fix. But involved in that lead time is all of these sort of sub-measurements, right? How much time are we spending waiting around? How much are we handing off work from person to person? And there's not many tools that we can use to sort of surface that information unless we spend a lot of time instrumenting the value stream and collecting a lot of data and analyzing it. So I'm going to be presenting value stream mapping as a method of collecting this data and putting it into a context that people can easily understand. What often happens in software teams is that we look at a pipeline, right? People are obsessed with kind of continuous integration, continuous delivery. And so we focus on the pipeline as a way of architecting that and then measuring that performance. And the risk is that the pipeline is really the pieces of the value stream that are highly automated already. Typically you plug some code into the pipeline and you get something in production that's spat out on the other side. But in between, it's almost entirely automated, right? So your opportunities for improvement are fairly slim compared to your the rest of the value stream, where you'll see these impacts on either side in terms of approvals or meetings, right? Planning sessions, handoffs between the person who's coming up with the idea and the person who's figuring out whether it's worth it to do it, and then prioritizing it and figuring out how we should approach it from a technical perspective. There's all this stuff that happens at the edges that actually takes up most of the time. And if you're just looking at the pipeline, we really don't have a good view of all of those manual pieces that could be wasting a lot of time. So if we look at a value stream in terms of its core components, when you really break it down, you've got a start point and an end point and a series of steps. And what makes a value stream so much more valuable than just a process diagram is this idea that we're layering on measurement. So this timing of each step, you see time on top of this start point, and then waiting between steps. As we start to measure the process with real quantifiable data, now we start to surface some insights about how things are performing. And that is something that's kind of rare and very valuable, especially when you have to be making decisions about where do we invest, where are we going to spend our time, what is really slowing us down. If you don't have measurements, it's very difficult to not only come up with those answers, but to agree on those answers, right? Because we all have our own interpretations of pictures whenever we see pictures. We all have our own interpretations of documents, conversations even. We can come away with very different understandings. But if we layer data on top of a picture, we're closing that gap of understanding where we can now be on the same page about what this is actually telling us. So to go back to the measurement piece in more detail, in context of a value stream, we could see the CI/CD pipeline idea right there in the middle, and it kind of only encompasses these two parts and missing everything sort of upstream and downstream from the left to the right. These four other measurements are extremely powerful, and you might recognize them as the four key metrics from an organization called DORA. If you've ever read a book called Accelerate, I was looking around because I have it somewhere. Oh, so this book is basically an illustration of common powerful metrics to measure software delivery velocity and sustainability. And if you're looking at trying to collect these measurements and layer them into a context that people can understand, a value stream really works extremely well. You can capture all four of these key metrics, and usually other metrics that matter both to the business and to the technology teams on top of a value stream, so that we have a quick way of collecting it. Usually a value stream mapping session takes half a day at most. So we can very, very quickly collect this information about a given process without spending a lot of time spinning up infrastructure and instrumenting things, building about a bunch of measurement automation to get the information that is really going to drive change in our business. So if we're looking more detail about an example value stream, in a larger organization, what typically happens is we look very, very high level to start, to get a good idea of where we're starting from, and we can dig in where we believe there's opportunities for improvement. So often in an organization that's extremely large, they'll have portfolios of products, and then they have individual products, and those individual products will have their own delivery streams. So by starting high, we can all be on the same page. I can talk to the CEO, I can talk to the board, and they all sort of understand from a very high level what we're talking about. And then we can dig in more detail. Whereas this might not matter to individual contributors on the team, it does matter to leadership. And then what we do from there is to sort of dig down. So let's say we're talking about the portfolio level, but we figure the product development cycle, we hear a lot of complaints or it doesn't seem to be performing. Let's figure out what's going on, right? So we can dig in specifically. And in this example case, this is a very, very large organization that I worked with. We dug down and the estimation was if we had automated deployment, we could improve our performance dramatically. And so by testing that hypothesis, we said, okay, well, if that's true, let's go look at what impact automated deployment would have on our software delivery velocity. So in this case, we dig and we dig. And what happens is we get to a point of staging deployment. This is something people often complained about. It was seen to be a huge bottleneck. So we had a good starting point of where we wanted to focus our energy. And then we laid out each individual step. And this is kind of a simplified example, but this is often exactly what it looks like. And by looking at this process end to end, this provides us some value. But what really becomes valuable is when we layer this measurement on top. So we start to look at what is the timing of each of the steps and what is the weighting between all the steps. And we start to see some hot spots, and these are highlighted in red, but they're even more visible once we sort of draw some boundaries around common hotspots. So what I was seeing is we've got obviously environment creation. There's a lot of time spent there, and then this idea of testing later in the process, there's a lot of time spent there. So it's worth looking at. In this case, 2 hotspots, 11 hours, 20 hours. These are definitely taking up a lot of time. By comparison, are they taking up a lot of time relative to something like automated deployment? So we look at Artifact Deploy, which is our automated deployment piece. Right now we're doing that, let's say we're doing that manually. So somebody has to run a command or something. It turns out it's not actually taking that much time at all. It's 15 minutes. It's probably somebody gets a message in Slack and they might run a command. Maybe sometimes it takes a long time, but the average case, it's not actually taking that much time. But we go back to 11 hours, 20 hours, maybe we can make a decision about where we should spend our time. And if we're looking at purely the highest number, obviously 20 hours is much higher than 11. But another thing that we can consider is this idea that at any stage in the pipeline or the process, something can fail and we might have to send it back, right? So in this case, we were spending a lot of time sending work back from initial testing or smoke testing, which is where we deploy something and figure out whether it's working or not. And if it throws up an error, we probably have to send it back and fix some configuration issue. So in this case, 60% of the time we would make a change, something would break, and we'd have to go back and fix it. So now maybe we're looking at closer to 20 hours upstream in environment creation. So these are the sort of insights that we can get, and now we can make uh, a very strong case for focusing in one place or the other. We might still end up spending time on acceptance testing, but at least we're not focused on automated deployments where there's actually no bottleneck, right? There's very limited opportunity for improvement there. And this is a case where they brought me in, they had a huge budget, they had many millions of dollars to spend. They wanted to spend it on artifact deployment. And that probably would have meant hiring a tool or a consulting company to come in, build something that wasn't really going to move the needle. And they were probably going to be 12 or 18 months away from figuring out that this hasn't actually improved anything. So by looking at the value stream, we did a very, very quick exercise to validate some assumptions and then target efforts where it would see the most impact. So mostly looked at steps and timing here, but as we lay out a value stream, we can start to layer on additional detail if we see value in really digging in. So you'll often see things like roles. So who is performing each step? And oftentimes what will happen is if you see a lot of delays, it often means that people are handing work to each other. And they might be handing work to each other in an automated way, but sometimes when it takes a long time, they're emailing each other, or they have to schedule a meeting and then they get on the same page and then passes from one person to the next. So highlighting the roles involved in each step can be extremely valuable, and it can be really eye-opening. I remember working with the last organization I was with, I was CTO. I was trying to figure out why it took us so long to onboard new customers. And we had to ingest a bunch of data, process it, get them all set up. And what was happening was we had about 20, 25 steps in that process. And almost every single step was performed by somebody else. Even if in some cases it was just pass to someone and then pass right back to somebody else. We had all this handoff, which meant that in some cases it was going to the Ukraine before it came back to Canada. And it was really eye-opening once we laid it out, and we actually just did it in a spreadsheet. But by getting that detail, we figured out, okay, well, what if we could just have the same person perform all these steps? We cut this down huge, and we dropped it actually from 6 weeks to 4 days. And it really wasn't that complicated. We just had to step away and look at it. So in addition to roles, we can look at tools involved. So what are the separate tools? Some of them integrate very well, some of them don't, and that can be an issue. Artifacts, what are we creating at each step? The idea of value added time is what percentage of each task is focused on creating value. And in some cases, we're not actually creating any value in a step, and we can just get rid of it because we can all agree this is not actually giving us a tangible benefit. Maybe especially in the context of our customers, we can figure out how to get some value a different way. And percent CNA, that's percent complete and accurate. It's kind of a technical term for quality, but what it really means is how much of the work that we generate at each stage is complete and accurate by the time the stage is done. But that's a good way of sort of measuring the quality of what's being created at each step. So in this example, to sort of wrap it up, beforehand, we had about 34 hours, and that's mostly made up of these 2 stages, environment creation and acceptance testing. And by focusing in those 2 areas, we can dramatically reduce that, because we all know, if we automate environment creation, we can shrink that down. In some cases, we can shrink it down to 10 minutes. And acceptance testing, if we're going from manual testing to automated testing, we can dramatically remove that as well. But oftentimes the difference is knowing what's at stake if you were to actually invest in those areas and then put effort directly towards them. And oftentimes we don't know, right? We can generally be following a target that's not really related to a value stream. And in that case, we don't know what the payoff is. We don't know what the ROI of improvement is, and we can't measure the impact of improvement. But by looking at the value stream, especially the before and after, we have a great story to tell the organization. And as a technical part of the organization, we can bring something to leadership and say, we've actually saved hours, dollars by making this improvement. And I think that really resonates, and it really helps build trust in the technical organization, which can be tough if you're strictly focused on getting the work done. So some other examples of before and afters in my experience, we're looking at days to hours, 5 hours to 10 minutes. We called this, originally we called this webinar 3 times, just to not really piss anybody off by being too ambitious. But in my experience, we see way more than 3 times improvement. I'm seeing 30 times, 60 times often. And oftentimes what you'll see is a 20% improvement just by doing a current state map. Because by looking at it, you can easily say, well, if I just didn't do this, or if I slightly change the way that I'm doing this, I would save a ton of time. So the average that I see from just laying out a current state map and documenting what we're doing in a visible way, it can really surface these opportunities for dramatic improvement. To kind of wrap up this idea of value stream mapping, to give you a high level view, I see it as a combination of visibility, measurement, and improvement. And I think combining all those together is extremely powerful. This idea that we don't often measure as much as we should. It's often very difficult to measure. We don't often have a good view of what's going on in an organization, and maybe some people do, but often not a lot of people, or not everybody. And if we want to improve, we need to have both visibility and measurement. We need to know where we are, what we're doing, what's working and what's not working, and then where our targeted efforts are actually going to pay off. So I see value stream mapping as really low impact, high value activity that we can perform as a team to come together and share the same view of what's happening so that we can improve it together. And not just for software delivery, I see this as valuable everywhere in a business. Really, when I talk about value streams in a business, I see every business as just a combination of value streams. You really don't have a company if you don't have value streams. But I think most people would be surprised once you go down this road to figure out really everything that we're doing on a regular basis is a value stream, right? It should be delivering value. It's involving multiple people. There's a process there, whether we acknowledge it or not. And I think the more we are intentional about creating and defining and improving these value streams, the more we will see dramatic impact in what we're getting as a result and what we're getting as outcomes. To kind of sum up some of the less tangible values of this, I really see that this is a highly relevant activity. It really deals with what your organization looks like right now, what you're working on right now. And it's a reflection of reality, which I think is very powerful. It's accessible in a way that whether you're in the leadership team, whether you're in the board or a customer, everybody can look at this and understand it. And if we go back to the original example of a value stream, I think there's a dramatic difference between what they can look like and what a valuable value stream looks like. If you boil it down to the core pieces, it's not that complicated. It doesn't have to be that complicated. And that means that everybody can get value from it. And I think that's very important. The act of defining the value stream is an extremely collaborative effort. So usually we want to get people who are responsible or accountable or consulted or informed, people who are affected by a value stream or involved in performing the actual work to define this. And oftentimes what I'll see with organizations, I'll run a value stream mapping session and somebody always says, I've never actually been in a meeting with these people before. This is the first time I've actually met Tom, and he's sending me work or I'm sending him work all the time, but we never talk. And so this is great that we're in the same room working together now. And that's always amazing. And it's amazing to hear people say, I've never actually known what this looks like. This is the first time I'm seeing it. And that's what you get from a value stream mapping session. I think it's incredibly powerful. The last piece I'll highlight, this is absolutely actionable data. It will give you opportunities that will pay off. You will see things that are going to make a difference. And that's, I think, in my experience, is rare in tech to be able to have confidence around if we actually focus in this area, we're going to get a result. A lot of what we do is trying and hoping for the best. So I think it's really powerful to have a mechanism that's giving us data that builds our confidence in going a specific way or focusing in a specific area. And I'll just leave you with final thought. I think it's incredibly important to start where you are. And that really means, under these circumstances, we're all in new environments. We're all dealing with different things that are unique and challenging. And I think that looking at our value streams, especially under changing conditions, is incredibly important, because what we assumed to be true 6 months ago, or what we assume to be true now, may be surprising if we really take a look at it. And I think if we're looking at ways to bring people together and share the same view now that we're all in separate places, it can be an incredibly powerful thing. So this is absolutely remote friendly. I do remote sessions all the time. There's a lot of good tooling for it too. So it's not something that only works if you're in the same room. There's a lot of value in bringing people together, whether they are in the same building or around the world. And with that, I will say thank you. I have slides that you'll be able to get to. This is being recorded. I've got some other hopefully valuable links for you if you're interested in more information. But with that, that's all I got, and hopefully we've got some good questions to answer.
Hey, thanks, Steve. That was awesome. Really appreciate that. Super interesting stuff, and I really liked it. We were talking about before we started the session just about process and defining your process throughout, throughout your kind of business and as you grow. So yeah, really appreciated this. This is taking process to a new level, I gotta say. So definitely liked it. Definitely helpful. I think you kind of touched on some of these things. I guess one of my things I was like, really taken by was really like, if you can see the causes of breakage, like, is there, I always look at the data of the big picture of things. Is there like the common traps people fall into? Like, do you see typical things where the breakage occurs? Is it organizational specific, vertical specific? I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that, just because you see a lot of this.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. That's a great question. And there definitely are common patterns. I think what you'll typically see as holding up a value stream or common bottlenecks are things like handoffs, where you're taking work from one person and they're handing it to somebody else. And this is less of a problem as we have smaller cross-functional teams. So if you've got like a product team where everybody's working on the same product and they're probably co-located, they probably all sit together, or they talk to each other on a regular basis, it's going to be less of an issue. But as we're seeing in traditional organizations, still very project oriented. So oftentimes those people can be siloed in different departments, and the only interactions they really have is like something shows up in my Jira queue because somebody has assigned it to me, and that's the interaction that I have. So that can take a long time. There can be missed communication. You kind of have to have a level of detail and a level of understanding for that to work well. And it's very, very challenging. So I think that often in handoffs, you'll see a lot of issues, not only with timing, but in quality too, because when you're handing off work, you're handing off context, right? You're handing off knowledge as well. And so it's a very expensive thing to do. And I think teams don't often look at how many handoffs do we have from start to finish in our process. And are there ways for us to unify more of that so that a single person is able to complete more of the value stream and create more value? And another piece of that is of course empowering the teams, right? So what kind of tools do they have available that allow them to not only make decisions on their own, but create value from scratch and get it into production. Um, that's often the case in smaller organizations or younger organizations, but in big companies, it can be extremely challenging to get approval from everybody, to get changes made so that your code has an environment that will treat it the way that it needs to be treated, or to run the way that it needs to run. So there can be a lot of moving pieces in large organizations, and so handoffs and dependencies can be really challenging. I think another common piece, though, that often doesn't get visualized is the idea of rework. So that's often the other biggest thing, is that oftentimes people will get something, like a developer will get a task, and either it was poorly defined from their perspective by product or whoever put it together, whoever wrote the story, whoever gave them the work. They feel that they didn't get enough information to really act on it, or they're missing some, there's something that they think is important that they don't see, right? So it gets thrown back. Or we have engineers build stuff and it breaks, and then it comes back to them and they have to fix it. And oftentimes, if you've got a long feedback cycle, if it takes 3 months from when you build something to when you find out that it's actually broken, and you're kind of in this position of, okay, what was I doing 3 months ago when I wrote that? Why would it be broken? What are all the things that have happened since that could have affected it? And so I think there's tons of value in saying, let's shorten that cycle. So as things break, we find out about it sooner, we're testing sooner, so that we can fix these things when they're relevant to us and we have all the context, versus, 3 months has gone by and we don't even remember doing that in the first place.
Yeah, great answer there. I guess another one I'm kind of seeing a theme among some of the questions in terms of like timing. When is a good time to get really going on this? Is something you should be doing early on as a company, or, what are some signals that you really need to start focusing on this?
Signals is that's a great frame for this. I really think that this should be a regular practice in organizations on a quarterly basis. So I think there's so much value in looking at how you're doing the work on a regular basis, because it really dictates the quality of the work that you're creating, your ability to pivot, your ability to adapt to new situations, and the happiness of your teams that are creating this work. If you look at a company like Google, they spend $1 billion a year on productivity and how people work. If you look at Microsoft, they have 1,500 people focused entirely on workflow. And your average organization, they don't spend time on this at all. This is not something that's part of their work. They kind of fix things when they're broken, and that can be efficient maybe, but it's not the most effective way to work. And I think that periodically looking at our value streams every quarter, hopefully we can demonstrate we're continuously improving. We're constantly leveling things up. And as we look at opportunities for automation, and if we're really making progress, things are very different 3 months from now than they are right now. So it can really make a huge impact revisiting the situation and taking a new current state. So I advise companies, take a current state wherever you are right now. Like if you don't have it, do it, right? It really doesn't take a ton of time. It's not a huge investment. You could do it entirely virtually. You can do it on your own, really, if you're really just dipping your toes in, you can do it on your own. Just illustrate what you understand of a process from end to end. There could be a lot of gaps in there. There can be a lot of empty spaces. And it can be a fun thought exercise to say, okay, well, how much do I really understand about how we're doing X? And what you can do on your own is you can sort of map it out, give it to other people and be like, these are big gaps for me. I don't really understand. This is a big cloudy thing, and this is a big cloudy thing. I kind of understand this piece, and I know where it starts and finishes maybe, but it can be a great team building exercise, right? To just bring it to other people and say, this is what I understand. What am I missing? Right. And I've worked in teams, especially smaller teams, where they're focused entirely on building and shipping. And then we get to the end of the value stream and it's like, uh, how are the salespeople finding out about this thing that you guys built? And how are they telling the customers? And who's writing the support documentation, right? And how is this being broadcast to from a marketing perspective? And there could be a big, big cloudy unknown thing. So all the stuff that you're building, no one finds out about it, right? Or they find out about it the wrong way. So your customers are just using the app one day and everything's moved around, or there's a new thing that they don't understand. And so by looking at the value stream and looking at this end to end, all of a sudden we realize, oh yeah, we got to bring sales in early and tell them that this is coming. We got to bring success in so that they can start writing documentation. And so at any time, at any stage, you can do this at any level of detail. It doesn't have to be a gigantic thing, but I think in larger organizations, you're going to find situations where it's like, we have millions of dollars to spend on making things better. If you're just going to randomly guess where to put that money and time, you're going to have a bad time. And that's why we see like $1 trillion wasted in transformation efforts, is because they don't start from the value stream. They don't start from what's really slowing us down, what's really causing friction in our processes.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, you got me thinking just by saying that. I mean, a lot of our audience that we get for a lot of these traction webinars are early stage companies who are going through, hyper scaling processes and, maybe just raised or scaling quickly and adding to their team. So you can see how this is super effective to take current state, understand, it's going to help you understand where you need to add resources to your team to help deliver your product quicker. So to your point, you should be doing this right now, getting a current state and understanding where your gaps are and your holes are, because then you can help with your hiring strategy by adding those pieces to the puzzle to your growth strategy. So 100% makes sense 100%. To be doing this right away.
Yeah. And another piece that I'll highlight about that is that what happens with an early stage company is that you're bringing people on and it takes a long time for them to get up to speed, right? I mean, there's a lot of context that they're missing. They might not know where they fit in the grand scheme of things. So being able to show them a value stream and saying like, this is the part that I need you to own, like I need you to actually level this up and make this 10 times better or 10 times faster or 10 times more efficient. That is humongous, right? If you're founder of the company or in leadership, the ability to point to a map and say like, this is the piece where everything is messed up and we need a lot of help is enormous, because without that, it's a ton of misunderstanding, a lot of long and complicated conversations, a lot of whiteboard drawings where you might not get the message across, right? And I think that risk is it's unacceptable. And the alternative of having the value stream and being able to point directly to it and everyone's instantly on the same page is just massive. It's humongous.
Do you find a lot of times you might see some of the value stream mapping points to the communication of information becomes the problem within the organization? And if that's true, how do you fix that?
That can absolutely happen. Oftentimes when you're looking at a value stream and you layer on roles and you layer on artifacts, like I kind of put information under the artifact column sometimes. And so we're looking at what is actually being passed from one step to another. And if there's different people, you got to make sure those people end up on the same page, right? And so it can kind of surface challenges with communication by saying, we created this value at this step, we got to this step, and all of a sudden we spun our wheels, right? Or we weren't created, the value went away either because we turned that idea, that value into a bug, or we built the wrong thing, or we half built it and we never got it finished. That can then loop back and we can say, okay, well, what could we add earlier in the process that's going to maximize our odds of success, right? Minimize the risk of us passing bad information or not enough information or misunderstanding downstream as we go through the value stream. So it can be really valuable to kind of capture that data in addition to just the steps and timing, because we're seeing, okay, where does it fall apart? Where are we sending it back for more clarity? And that can kind of avoid these communication issues. But we can kind of intentionally look at designing the value stream to maximize our communication.
Another great question here. Curious about this. What is the adoption rate for value stream mapping in software organizations? Is this a newer concept or been around for a while?
That's an excellent question. It's really gaining steam lately. I think that it was relatively unheard of, probably 2017. I was hearing about it in 2014 in the DevOps space, in the enterprise DevOps space. It really is kind of a practice for much larger organizations currently, but they do it the old way. They do it the old complex way. There's somebody who's certified in like Six Sigma, lean process improvement, and they work in a silo and no one ever sees it. I think now 2019, 2020, what we're seeing is this is becoming the way that you do DevOps transformation. This is the context by which all of your automation efforts, all of your continuous improvement, all of your focus on pipelines and software delivery are coming together under this vision of the value stream, and it really puts everything in context. Whereas what you would have previously is you'd have kind of a North Star, maybe someone in the organization says we need to be more like Netflix, and then everyone kind of tries to figure out what that is, right? And they might hear, okay, well, if you automate CI/CD, then you're getting closer. So let's do that thing. But that might not be your actual bottleneck. And so now the other piece that I think was slowing this down and getting in the way was this idea of like maturity models. So a lot of people came out with this idea, especially in DevOps, of like, what does good look like? What is an awesome practice? And then what's not that great and what's really bad? And how do you get from really bad to really great? And it's kind of this like checklist or a series. And I was part of this. I built something called the DevOps checklist in 2014. It was like, make sure you think about X, Y, Z, all these things. But the weakness there and the weakness of maturity models is this idea that you're figuring out where you stand compared to an arbitrary list of things, right? It doesn't speak to you where you are right now. It's not actionable. It doesn't tell you what the next thing you should be doing is. In some cases, it could be prioritized. But I think the value of value stream mapping is you're getting information about what you should do next based on where you are right now. And there's no other tool that I know of that gives you that level of actionable information. So it's really kind of exploding now. And 2020, I think, is a year where people are really going to start talking about it seriously, because not only does it move the needle for tech, it moves the needle for every other part of the business.
Fantastic. One question I got here, which is interesting, just, compared to Kanban, Agile, Waterfall, the different methodologies, is there, value stream mapping that works better in some, methodologies than others? Like for you, who's like the value stream expert, what do you prefer? What do you recommend for a team? Or is it really just based on circumstances?
It's a good question. I think, it doesn't require any sort of environment. If you go into an organization that's fully waterfall, and I've walked into organizations that are fully waterfall, which is incredibly sequential, you don't test until everything is done. And what you can do with a value stream is demonstrate, okay, if we map this out, we can go from 3 years down to 3 months. No problem. We could do that like almost instantly. And we'll just rearrange how we're doing things. So in terms of putting things in context for companies that want to go from waterfall to something more agile, this is giving you an opportunity to really visualize what that looks like. What do you actually have to change? Instead of just trying to go faster and trying to break things down, now we can start rearranging things and saying, okay, we're going to do these things in parallel, right? In the context of flow. I would say that where it maps best is in a Kanban environment, right? Because Kanban's entirely focused on flow. It's entirely focused on how are we managing work in progress through the system and minimizing constraints. And so it probably maps closest to that, which is kind of the evolution of productivity in teams, right? I think you'll see in highly capable, high functioning, high performing teams, they're running much closer to Kanban than they are like a Scrum or traditional other agile methodology, just because this concept of flow is so important, right? The idea of let's take a unit of work, an idea, a feature, a bug fix, and get it through the system as quickly as possible so we can get feedback and then incorporate that into making things better. Works really well in Kanban. You can essentially map a lot of your value stream onto stages in Kanban as well. So there's a lot of great commonalities, but it really works in any organization, especially if you're trying to go from one model to another model.
I need some traction.